Welcome to Malard at Large. My guest today is Reza Pahlavi, son of the late Shah of Iran, opponent #1 to the Ayatollahs. Before we talk to him, first a portrait by Romain Le Petit.
If Iran were still a monarchy, he would be ruling the country. Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah, was born in Tehran in 1960. He studied at a private school in the royal palace, and then, while he was still young, was trained as a fighter pilot. He was sent to the United States when he was 18 to continue his pilot training at the prestigious Reese Air Force Base in Texas. He was thus far from home when the Islamic Revolution shook his country and deposed his father in 1979. Instead, he joined his parents in exile in Morocco, Bahamas, and Mexico. When his father died in 1980 in Egypt, Reza Pahlavi proclaimed himself Shah of Iran under the 1906 Constitution. He made a big splash in the international arena in December 2011 when he asked the United Nations Security Council to bring the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, before international courts to be tried for crimes against humanity. Today, Reza Pahlavi still lives in the U.S., but in Iran, his name is often chanted during protests against the ruling regime. Wherever he is, Reza Pahlavi activates his network. He frequently travels to Europe, meeting opponents to the Ayatollahs, who were once opponents of his father. He also meets the foreign press that reports on his fight to overturn the ruling regime.
Whatever the political differences, the most important thing is that today we are all in the same boat, if I may say. We have a common threat. We all have to face a common enemy, that is the Islamic regime that today rules our country.
In the U.S., he maintains relationships with the large Iranian diaspora and broadcasts speeches on television to the 3,500,000 strong Iranian community living in the United States. He has been invited several times to Congress to outline his vision for Iran, his ambitions, and his opinion. On September 28th, he lifted the veil on his intentions and published a 15-minute-long solemn speech on his Instagram account, a call to rebellion.
The path to victory is clear. We must connect strikes, protests, and civil disobedience in various parts of the country to one another. We must form small protest circles, and we must promote civil disobedience in all its forms.
The Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, is Christian Mallard's guest on today's edition of Malard at Large.
Highness, welcome to Malard at Large again on I-24 News. A few weeks ago, you delivered a speech to the Iranian nation to whom you offered a new covenant for a future very different from the one they have put up with until now. So my first question will be, you tell your compatriots the only acceptable alternative is the rule of the people of Iran with no tyranny and no monopolization of power by one individual of one group. Do you think it's really possible after 41 years of heavy Ayatollarchy, as I call it?
First of all, Christian, let me thank you for inviting me to your new program and giving me yet another opportunity to speak to your viewers. It is precisely because of 41 years of living under oppression and darkness and complete violation of human rights that the Iranian people know that not only what they do not want anymore, but in fact, what do they want? And popular sovereignty and the rule of the people is really the bottom line issue here. And therefore, just because you have lived under tyranny in 41 years doesn't mean that you're not prepared or unable to understand the importance of that, which is quite vivid today, especially among the Iranian youth.
But you call the army and the people for civil disobedience in all its forms, in all parts of the country. Will you be heard and followed by the population, you think?
Well, apart from the civilians, if you're referring to the armed forces, let's not forget that the military at the time of the Iran-Iran war fought bravely to defend our homeland and have never been an instrument of oppression or repression. As far as the IRGC is concerned, the bulk of them who are now being seen as a culprit of the regime are not in any form or shape partaking in the interest, especially the economic interest that the top leadership, which is extremely corrupt, is involved with. And therefore, defections are beginning to occur in the sense that they want to rejoin with the people, having been totally disillusioned with the system. And the reason I'm calling for civil disobedience precisely is because we want to avoid as the French would say, règlement de compte. We are not talking about revenge. We're talking about amnesty and national reconciliation. For the Iranian people who are defenseless and unarmed vis-a-vis the regime's oppressive elements, the protection of the military and other elements that will join with them would limit the amount of violence that may be unavoidable, but the whole point is to limit it to a point that there's the least amount of bloodshed and cost for a more peaceful change than any kind of violent scenarios.
A little quick follow-up, Your Highness, is, but after so many slaughters of the people who have been the victims of these slaughters, do you think they will still have the strength, the courage to get into the street for civil disobedience?
Look, I think that the X factor that will tilt in favor of the Iranian people has a lot to do in how the international community responds to their call for support. Every time we have seen an end to dictatorships or totalitarian regimes, the civilians who are fighting their respective oppressive regimes could not do it totally alone without some sense of international support. And we saw that in the case of many changes that has occurred in the latter part of the 20th century. From Poland to South Africa to Eastern Europe and many other places, it could not have been conceivable for unarmed people to fight their oppressive regimes without the world backing them up in terms of support for labor forces, support for intellectuals, dissidents, and what have you. The Iranian people have done so far everything with no help whatsoever. What will tilt the balance in their favor is for them to know that the world stands with them as opposed to dealing with their oppressors, and that could be the biggest change that we hope we will be able to obtain. However, let's assume this were not to happen. Do we have a choice as a nation? Do we have a choice to back off? Do we have a choice to accept defeat? Do we have a choice to tolerate injustice? Of course not. And that's the question that the world needs to answer. Are you going to be on the side of the Iranian people who only want to have their liberties and justice and equality and put an end to discrimination and slaughter? Or do you want to treat with a regime that has been the root cause of their repression and, of course, tons of problems for the rest of the world at the same time?
But you say, I don't want to see my country sold off to foreign powers. Your father has been betrayed by the West, by the United States and France, by former American President Jimmy Carter and former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who played the Khomeini card. What makes you think that the new Iran won't be sold off to the US, China, and Russia?
Strength of any country depends on the legitimacy and stability of their institutions and political order. A democratic nation of 84 million people cannot be sold off. Because the Iranian regime has no legitimacy, and because of its enmity vis-a-vis the West, it has pretty much depended in supporting itself by allying itself with, for instance, Russia and China. And as a result, it is auctioning off our country, as we have seen. This will not occur under a regime that is independent and is strengthened in its legitimacy and the support of its own population, and therefore cannot be exploited. That's the vision of a future that I can see, and a country that, with its complete sovereignty and independence, would be able to have cordial relations on a 360-degree premise. We don't have to be enemies of anyone, so long as our rights and sovereignty is respected by anyone.
We have a commercial, Your Highness. We get back to you in a few minutes.
I-24 News team of talented correspondents are working hard for you. They're in the markets, on the streets, in the battlefields, getting the pulse of the story. Tune in for Beyond the Headlines to see how the top stories of the week are affecting real people. No commentary, no debate, just the best stories presented by our best journalists.
Strictly Security, your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. Our team brings the latest on the major international conflicts, analysis of the major security issues right here in the Middle East and around the globe. Join us for a close look at innovative military technology and get up to speed with what's happening in cyberspace. Saturdays, only on I-24 News.
Your Highness, in a bit more than 2 weeks, it will be presidential election day in the US. What kind of issue do you expect after an awful, pathetic, tragic, I should say, political mess?
My position has always been, insofar as US politics is concerned, to be talking to both sides of the aisle, as they say here, and to expect from either the Democrats or the Republicans a bipartisan attitude vis-à-vis my country. In that sense, whoever ends up in the White House in 2021, I hope that that person will stand with the people of Iran as opposed to vis-à-vis them by continuing negotiation with a dying regime that is losing legitimacy more and more and is on its final path to complete implosion and decline.
But Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, said lately about Donald Trump's policy on Iran, I quote, "There may be more intelligent way to tackle Iran's policy of destabilization of the Middle East and talk about diplomacy." Do you really think Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards understand the word diplomacy?
What they understand is a lifeline, and whoever throws any kind of lifeline to which they can cling on to survive a bit longer is whatever it is that they will try to do. The important thing is to understand that this regime is on its way out. And what's important to understand, therefore, is the alternative is represented by millions of Iranian people who want to get rid of this system and hope that the world see the same way that they do and are, in fact, in touch with the reality on the grounds in Iran today. Therefore, whether it's the US president or any other heads of state for that matter, especially in the Western world looking into the issue, it is the expectation and demand of my compatriots to make sure that they stand on the right side of the equation, meaning with the people of Iran, rather than endlessly continue negotiating with a regime that has more than often violated its pact and basically is there to repress at any cost to maintain itself in power. The Iranian people will not forget those who stand with them in times of difficulties and those who practically throws them under the bus in the name of diplomacy or security, national interest, or national security interest, or what have you.
After the recent destruction by Israel cyber attacks or other means from inside Iran of part of nuclear plants and warehouses harboring missiles, nuclear heads, would you say the nuclear program might be delayed and is still a threat for Israel and the region?
Look, I think we have to think beyond just the nuclear issue. The real threat is the regime itself. As the saying goes, it's the finger on the trigger. It has always been the case. And as long as this regime maintains itself in power, it continues to be a threat, whether it's using conventional weapons or nuclear weapons. The only way to put an end to any kind of threat that emanates from Iran is to have a change of regime. And I think many in the region understand and realize that.
How would you qualify the attitude of the Europeans, and especially the one of Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, and Boris Johnson, who wanted to circumvent US sanctions and save the nuclear deal with Iran, which is a terrorist state?
Precisely, and again, as I say, we need to remind European leaders that if they claim that they understand what's happening in Iran, then their stance doesn't go along with that premise. Because the regime is dying. The regime is on its way out. People are on the streets every day chanting against it, chanting death to the dictator. They want something else. They want modernity. They want progress. They want freedom, none of which can be achieved so long as the regime is kept in place. Now, standing with the regime rather than the people is basically being in bed with the enemy. And one day they will have to account to the Iranian people that will be liberated. I have no doubt in that matter. Whose side were they on? This is an expectation that needs to be addressed by political leaders. And the problem that we have had all these years is that basically the world has only dealt with the regime and its representative, but never had any engaged dialogue with the Iranian people and their representative within the secular democratic forces. There is an alternative, so long as you're willing to look at it and think beyond what you see on the immediate horizon.
A quick follow-up. Would you say that the Europeans are coward and are scared to face Iran straightfrontly?
Look, let's say that if one of the objectives of carrying out some kind of a deal with the regime is to open up avenues for economic interest, let's talk about this for a second. Any kind of going to business with this regime has consequences, in the sense that this regime, which is harboring, terrorists, human trafficking, all sorts of problems, and dealing with extremely corrupt elements, I think it creates some liabilities for any companies engaged in such relationship with this regime. And I'm sure shareholders of these companies should be concerned about knowing their partner. And who are you actually doing business with? And I think this is something that you cannot simply close an eye on, because it will have severe legal consequences down the line. And I don't think it bodes well for long-term relationship between our countries.
Your Highness, how do you react to the IAEA saying for a long time that since May 2019, Iran has not respected the nuclear deal? How do you explain that the Europeans in particular go on and try to save this regime?
But look, it's not the first time the regime has been in violation to its agreement. Have we forgotten about Natanz and Fordo that were discovered and not declared? So it's not the first time, and it won't be the last time. The regime has proven time and again to use subterfuge and deception in order to achieve its ends. As a result, I don't know what the degree of legitimacy or trust you can put in a regime that has more often than not violated that. Again, let me repeat, the only time you can expect transparency, cooperation, and care can only be in a regime that in the first place worries about its own citizens. And any regime that worries about the best interests of its nation knows full well that the more you have an element of stability and cooperation and friendliness with your neighbors and beyond, the more you can promote that. Look at what the regime has actually done. It has fomented terrorism. It's trying to use its proxies to interfere in the affairs of other countries, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq, all over the place. That's not the mark of a regime that is trying to establish trust and transparency. To the contrary. And we shouldn't be surprised about it, because in its DNA, it cannot do anything other than what it has done all these years. How much longer do we need to put the evidence on the table for the world to see?
Would you say, Your Highness, that through its rapprochement with United Arab Emirates and other Gulf states, Israel builds up a strong anti-Iran and proxies axis?
What we have witnessed is a great trend that it indicates the aspiration of such countries to go on down the path of modernity and improvement and development in a spirit of cooperation. What I would call it an alliance for progress. And I'm sure this is a kind of alliance that the Iranian people would like to also be part of. You don't have to be anti-something to demand progress and modernity. However, vis-a-vis this process of alliance of progress, there is an axis of resistance comprised of the regime and its proxies that resist that because of their vehement anti-Westernism or whatever it is that has constantly placed them in a position to be antagonistic to any nation that would like to go down that path. The contrast is simple. Look at the people today living in Dubai, as opposed to the people living in the Iraq or Syria under Assad or Hezbollah or everything that we see in the Middle East. The contrast couldn't be clearer. And the reason why they should be deprived of these opportunities goes directly because they're being interfered with by a regime that is trying to resist that path. Again, once this regime disappears, the whole region will see the benefit of it.
How would you qualify the attitude of Russia, which closes its eyes on Israeli planes attacks upon Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria, and at the same time having good relationship with Iran and Turkey, to which they sell S-400 missiles?
Well, again, as I stated earlier, losing legitimacy and having been vehemently anti-Western has forced the current regime to sell off to the other sides in the equation and trying to cling on for their own power by depending more than ever on countries like Russia and China, for instance. But I think that Russia fully understands that in the long term, that's not tenable. And if they're turning a blind eye over this issue, is indicative that unlike what the regime is desperately hoping for, Russia is willing to look past this to a longer future and doesn't see Iran as a long-term card to play. It might be short-term, but it will not be long-term. And I think that's an indication of it.
As it is in the news, I have to ask you a question. What do you think of the attitude of Turkish President Erdogan challenging precisely Russia in Syria, Libya, in the Caucasus region, and USA inside NATO?
You know, the relationship that my grandfather established with Ataturk in Turkey by bringing modernity and secularism to our respective countries was really a major turn in the history of our region. Sadly, we all realize what happened since the Iranian Revolution to reverse that path in Iran itself. What's less obvious is a reversal away from secularism in Turkey these days. And the fact that right now you're talking about a government that is more prone to supporting organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas is indicative of something that could be problematic for our region. It's a reversal of the path to the direction of progress and secularism. And this is something that should be of major concern to all other actors in the region.
Are you appalled at the fact, when I tell you, are you appalled at the fact that French President Macron is negotiating with Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Well, the very same way the Iranian people have been taken hostage by the Islamic regime, the Lebanese people have been taken hostage by Hezbollah, which is a proxy of the regime. And so long as you have the regime in place, with the Hezbollah in Lebanon taking orders from Khamenei, how do you expect the situation to be resolved in a country like Lebanon? And for that matter, many other countries in the region, like the Iraqis and others who know that the finger inside, that the regime is putting inside each of these countries is creating a whole bunch of problems. Again, Mr. Macron and others should realize that, once again, nothing can develop so long as the regime and its proxies are at play. All the way to Venezuela, as I mentioned in another interview recently, the regime has had its hands all over the place, and the tentacles of this octopus have propagated all over the place. Once we get rid of the regime in Iran, the problem in the Middle East, in many shapes and forms, from terrorism to nuclear threat to interference and so many other issues, will be resolved immediately, and we will see a major turnaround. So insisting on trying to break a deal with the regime in containing their status quo goes against the grain of conventional wisdom.
I have a last question, Your Highness. The embargo upon the selling of arms to Iran is going to be lifted at the UN. Don't you fear catastrophic consequences of that?
Look, again, every time you give yet another lifeline to the regime to use cash like Obama gave them to spend on their ends, which was not the people dying of hunger in Iran today, or if tomorrow it's going to be more arms at their hands for them to do God knows what and where, is showing the fact that you are, in fact, instead of reinforcing and empowering the people, you're, in fact, empowering a dying regime. And you cannot expect to give elements of survival to repressive regime and hope that they will come across as, goodwill actors. They're not. It's helping the dark side, not the right side.
Your Highness, I want to thank you very much. Our conversation has to come to an end right now. Probably we have other opportunities to have you again in Malard at Large on I-24 News. Many thanks again.